How does a high school student voted most likely to succeed later become a man who believes the only way to save California from a catastrophic earthquake is through a human sacrifice? Why did a delusion of cosmic duty compel a man to kill 13 people in 5 months? Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Herbert Mullin case. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. Herbert Mullin's psychological descent didn't start with a murder. It began years earlier with a devastating loss and a fascinatingly common psychological coping mechanism. The first psychological indicator we see is the sudden catastrophic impact of a friend's death in the summer of 1965. Mullin was 18 and had just graduated from the San Lorenzo Valley High School. His close friend, Dean Richardson, was killed in a car accident. This loss seemed to act as a potent psychological trigger, shattering Mullin's seemingly perfect reality. He began building literal shrines to Richardson in his room. This intense, almost ritualistic focus on the deceased is a red flag, indicating an inability to process grief in a healthy way. It became a psychological fixation on the idea of reincarnation, a way to bypass the finality of death and keep the relationship alive. This obsession led him down a path of deep spiritual and psychological confusion. For a person with an underlying predisposition, a traumatic event like this can be a catalyst that unhinges reality. The next major red flag appears just a few years later, in 1968, when he began demonstrating echopraxia, the involuntary elimination of another person's movements. Witnesses saw him imitating his brother-in-law's every move at a family dinner. This is a behavioral sign that is often associated with disorganized or catatonic symptoms of a psychotic disorder, specifically schizophrenia. It's a clue that the brain's internal monitoring system, which tells us I am doing this action, is beginning to fail. This is when the personal behaviors of youth take a much darker turn into clinical psychology. What is the psychological significance when a person's behavior becomes involuntary and mimics others? Mullin's life began to spiral with erratic behavior and drug use. In 1969, at the age of 22, he voluntarily checked himself into the state hospital. This is where the psychological landscape of the case really comes into focus. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, aggravated by drug abuse. This diagnosis is the foundational to understanding the motive for his eventual crimes. Schizophrenia, particularly the paranoid type, involves a break from reality, characterized by delusions and hallucinations. For Mullin, this break would have later provided the horrific justification he needed. However, his journey through the mental health system was one of non-compliance. He was uncooperative with treatment and was discharged with having a poor prognosis. He would spend the next several years in and out of 5 different mental hospitals, often being discharged because he was deemed not a danger to himself or others, only to stop taking his antipsychotic medication. Is compliance with mental health treatment the primary psychological bridge between delusion and violent action? The year 1972 is when Mullin's internal paranoid world crashed into an external world. He was 25 and moved back home with his parents in Santa Cruz. His core delusion began to form around April 18th, his own birthday. He fixated on this date because it was the anniversary of the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The self-centered psychological association linking a personal date to a massive historical catastrophe is a hallmark of a delusion of grandeur or reference. He believed he had a cosmic role to play. The delusion was that the Vietnam War had provided enough death or blood sacrifice to appease nature and prevent another earthquake. But with the war winding down, the voices began. Mullin began to hear command hallucinations, specifically his father's voice, as he later claimed. The psychological drive was no longer about preventing death through spiritual belief in reincarnation, but actively causing it to prevent a greater disaster. On October 13, 1972, he acted on these delusions. His first victim was Lawrence White, a transient man Mullin had encountered while driving. Mullin beat White to death with a baseball bat. He later claimed White had been telepathically communicating with him, saying, "Hey man, pick me up and throw me over the boat. Kill me so that others will be saved." This alleged communication is a critical psychological clue. It's a form of projection. By attributing the desire to be killed to his victims, Mullin psychologically distanced himself from the moral weight of his actions. He was not the killer. He was an agent, an instrument of his victims and the universe's will. 11 days later, he killed a 24-year-old college student, Mary, who was hitchhiking. This murder reveals a different, more morbid psychological curiosity. Mullin drove her to a remote location and stabbed her. But what happened next provides a shocking insight into his distorted thought process. He disemboweled her, hoping to find physical proof that her blood was polluted, supporting his hypothesis that the environment was rapidly poisoning people. Does the need to physically examine a person's internal organs reveal a psychological attempt to justify the irrational through empirical yet delusional science? The psychology of Mullin's motive is not rooted in traditional lust or power, but a desperate psychotic attempt at environmental salvation. He was a visionary serial killer, motivated purely by the internal demands of his delusions. Just over a week later, on November 2nd, 1972, Mullin, a lifelong Catholic, went to St. Mary's Catholic Church. His motive this time shows a complex blend of delusion and religious guilt. He entered the confessional booth not just to confess his crimes, but possibly to seek external validation or absolution for his cosmic duty. The victim was Father Henry. Mullin brutally stabbed a 64-year-old priest to death inside the confessional. He later claimed he did this to protect himself from exposure, suggesting that in his psychotic state, he saw the priest as a threat to his grand mission. This is a profound psychological act, murdering the very person who represents forgiveness and moral authority. It demonstrates the extent to which his mental illness had shattered his core religious and ethical framework, replacing it with a psychotic mandate. What psychological conflict is revealed when a religious person kills the one person who offers forgiveness? The randomness of his victim selection is another major psychological clue. His victims ranged from a transient man to a college student to a Catholic priest. There was no consistent victimology, which is often seen in killers driven by pure delusion rather than a specific sexual or power fantasy. The murder weapons were equally random: a baseball bat, a knife, and later a gun. This lack of a signature weapon indicates that the crime was driven by the immediate necessity of the command hallucination, not the gratification derived from a particular method. After the priest murder, Mullin appeared to briefly cease killing. This pause is intriguing from a psychological perspective. It could indicate a period of relative lucidity, a temporary break in a psychotic episode, or a belief that the priest's death had temporarily fulfilled the quota for his earthquake prevention ritual. However, the delusion would soon return with devastating effect, and this time the target was much closer to home, showing a frightening shift in his psychological focus. In January 1973, Mullin decided his next victim should be those who introduced him to drugs. He had developed a new delusion that marijuana had caused his mental illness, and therefore these people were responsible for his psychological distress. This is a classic example of blaming an external source for internal pathology. By placing the blame on others, he could justify their elimination as a way of curing himself and his world. He went to the old residence of a former friend, Jim, who had previously introduced him to marijuana. Jim had moved, but Mullin encountered the new occupants, Kathy, and her two young children. Mullin tracked down Jim at his new home and on January 25, 1973, shot and repeatedly stabbed both Jim and his wife, Joan. The fact that he used both a gun and a knife shows an overkill that speaks to an extreme level of psychological rage, perhaps a mixture of his drug-related paranoia and a general command to kill. But the story doesn't end there. Mullin went back to the Francis residence and murdered Kathy and her 2 children. This escalation is a horrifying psychological moment. Does a sudden escalation from targeting a responsible party to eliminating innocent bystanders indicate a complete erosion of moral boundaries within a psychotic state? It's believed that he killed Kathy to eliminate the witness to his inquiry about Jim's location. This element of premeditation and witness elimination shows that even within his delusional state, he was capable of a degree of rational self-protective thought. This is what made his defense, innocent by reason of insanity, so complex. The murders continued. On February 10, 1983, Mullin encountered 4 teenage campers in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Robert, David, Brian, and Mark. He asked them to leave the premises. Mullin later claimed he asked them telepathically if he could kill them, and they all responded yes. He then shot all 4 boys. This claim of a telepathic conversation and affirmative consent is another psychological window into the world of auditory and telepathic command hallucinations. The delusion had grown so strong that he believed his victims were willing participants in his cosmic mission. He didn't see them as individuals. He saw them as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. How does a person's psychological need to believe their victim's consent to their own death facilitate the act of murder? Mullin's killing spree ended abruptly on February 13th in 1973. His final victim was a 72-year-old retired fisherman, Fred Perez, who he shot with a rifle in broad daylight while Perez was tending to his garden. This final act was the undoing of his short reign of terror. Mullin committed this final murder after a disagreement over a shared driveway near his childhood home. A neighbor who saw Mullin free quickly recorded his license plate number. This simple, non-cosmic, impulsive, and easily traceable act is the ultimate psychological failure of his grand mission. The cosmic savior was caught because of a common, everyday disagreement. When a killer's crimes are driven by a grand delusion, why does their downfall often come from a petty, mundane mistake? After his trial, Mullin didn't deny the killings. He confessed, maintaining that his motive was to save California from an earthquake. The prosecution successfully argued that some of the crimes, like the premeditated murder of Jim and a subsequent murder of Francis to eliminate a witness, showed rational intent, which is legally incompatible with insanity. The court was presented with overwhelming evidence of a psychotic disorder, specifically paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution argued for culpability, while the defense argued for legal insanity based on his inability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions due to his delusions. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the premeditated killings of Jim and Kathy, and 8 counts of second-degree murder for the impulsive killings driven by immediate delusions. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case of Herbert Mullin is a stark psychological study of a person whose life was hijacked by untreated severe mental illness. His story is a powerful reminder that the why of the crime in cases of severe psychosis is a personal internal logic driven by a profoundly distorted reality. The sheer unpredictability of his victimology, the bizarre rationale of his mission, and the tragic pattern of entering and leaving mental health facilities only to stop taking his medication, all piece together the psychological picture of a killer driven by an internal, unshareable universe. His motivation was not power, lust, or revenge in a typical sense, but a horrifying self-proclamation, a psychotic duty to humanity. How do societies better identify and intervene when a person's grand delusions become a mandate for extreme violence? This is a real tragic case of someone who had severe mental illness. The mental health institutions try to help him, but he was non-compliant. And we don't know the whole backstory. We don't know all the different things that he said to the psychologist, the psychiatrist who treated him. But we do know that his paranoid delusions drove him. It was a powerful driver. And when that type of delusions drive somebody, there's no telling of the violence that they can commit. Now, I want to be very clear here. Just because someone has a mental illness, whether it's schizophrenia or another delusional disorder, doesn't mean they're going to be a killer like Herbert was. They can be dangerous to themselves or others, but not necessarily a killer. We want to offer compassion and help, but we also want to be very aware of those around us that have these severe mental illnesses. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.